I told him I'd rather touch myself than have him pleasure me, and he lost his mind. It's ironic how the words we speak can build or destroy everything we hold dear in an instant, often in ways we least expect. Where did it all go wrong? Why did it take losing everything for me to realize how happy and fortunate I truly was? How do I take back the words I spoke in the heat of the moment? Words that have now become a knife at my neck. If only I could return to that day, I'd stop myself from saying the very words that have left me trapped in this overwhelming sadness and emptiness. My name is Rita, and I'm in my early 30s. I married my husband, Josh, 6 years ago after being dumped by my lover, Daniel, at the time. Left with no choice, I married Josh because I was already pregnant and couldn't bear the shame of having a child out of wedlock. To make matters worse, the child's father wanted nothing to do with me and left to marry his longtime fiancée, who had suddenly resurfaced. Her return shattered my world, leaving me broken and torn apart. My husband, Josh, and I have been friends since college, and his feelings for me were no secret. However, he never found the courage to confess them, and I chose to ignore it, pretending I didn't notice because I was deeply in love with Daniel. Even though I was in a relationship with someone else, Josh remained by my side as a friend. His affection for me remained unchanged. After Daniel dumped me that day, I went to Josh crying from the heartache, and I was shocked when he asked me to marry him. I already knew I was pregnant and had confided in my mom and close friends, who all advised me to marry him without revealing my pregnancy. Afraid of losing Josh too, I kept my pregnancy a secret, and I agreed to marry him. At that moment, it was the only way to save face and to gather the shattered pieces of my life. I convinced myself that any woman in my position would have done the same and that I was simply doing the right thing. I seized the opportunity and married Josh, even though I didn't love him the way he loved me. Just like that, I had successfully buried my past and given both myself and my child a chance at a new life. Things were going smoothly as I wanted, and I was happy. Josh was the sweetest husband one could ever need. He took care of me and our child, and he did his best to make sure I was very happy. Despite his demanding job that required much of his time, Josh never made me feel like he wasn't there or that I was alone. He always ensured he spent weekends with us and found time to take me and our child on vacations. He did everything he could to support us, giving me everything a woman could ever wish for. Yet why did I have to ruin it all and reopen the very wounds I had worked so hard to bury? Everything went wrong the day my daughter got really sick and I had to take her to the hospital. My husband was away on a business trip as usual, and I couldn't reach him that day. To my greatest surprise, the doctor in charge of my daughter's treatment was my ex, Daniel. I was left feeling perplexed that day, as I just couldn't believe how small the world was and the possibility that we would meet again, and in that kind of way. After my daughter was admitted, Daniel tried to talk to me, but I refused to listen to him because seeing him brought back old memories. It was so overwhelming that it made me realize I still loved him. I refused to speak with him, drawing a line that we should stick to the doctor-patient relationship. I told him I was married, and so was he, and I didn't want people to get the wrong impression about us. It wouldn't be good for either of us, considering our history together. Daniel seemed to get the message, and we were doing well treating each other as strangers. My husband hurried back the moment I told him about our child's condition, and although he wanted to stay longer, he had to leave quickly as he couldn't be away for too long. But that didn't stop him from calling, both through video calls and voice calls, at every little chance he had, making it almost feel like he was right there with us. Things remained strong between us until I began to waver. I don't know why, but my thoughts started to shift. It began when my daughter's condition started improving, and I would often see her and Daniel together. They had become so close that they would spend most of the day together, and it left me feeling uneasy. He was so kind and sweet to my daughter, and most times I started to get the feeling of how happy we would have been if Daniel hadn't dumped me and chosen another lady over me. I began to picture Daniel as my husband and how sweet he and my daughter, or should I say our daughter, looked together, and at that moment, it felt so different from how it was when it was with Josh. We felt like a complete family, and I would find myself smiling each time he came around to check up on my daughter. I guess that's how I became stupid and messed up. That day, Daniel had come into the room to check on my daughter as usual when something so stupid happened. I got up to get my daughter some water since she had asked for it, and I was distracted as my attention was on Daniel, causing the glass to slip from my hand and shatter on the ground. Daniel immediately rushed over to me, pulling me to himself. For a second, my heart stopped, and it was as if something in me started burning. I hadn't felt that way in a long time, and even throughout the years I spent with Josh in our marriage, I had never felt such emotions. It all happened so easily, just from being that close to Daniel. He asked if I was hurt and okay with so much concern that my heart started to race. I felt so flustered that I immediately rushed out of the room. I had avoided Daniel all day for some foolish reasons I don't know. Later that day, my friend had visited, and I told her about the incident earlier with Daniel. She told me if I loved him that much that there was no harm trying to ignite that passion between us, especially if Daniel felt the same way for me too, and just like I fell into the trap of temptation. That day after my daughter finished receiving her regular checkup, Daniel had informed me that she had fully recovered and could be discharged soon. Then he asked if we could have dinner together at least once since we might not be seeing each other again after my daughter gets discharged. It was something I was actually hoping for deep down inside of me, so I quickly accepted. So that night, I left my daughter with my mom and went out on a date with Daniel, which was such a disgusting and irresponsible thing to do as a married woman. We both had dinner that night, and we talked so much about our past. He told me about how much he regretted hurting me, and since that day, there were days he wished he could go back to that very moment and change the decision he had made that day. He told me that if only he had been bold enough to decide for himself and not follow his family's decision, maybe things would have been happier between us. Hearing his words, it was as if he had just spoken my mind. I was so overwhelmed by it that I didn't know when I kissed him. I was such an idiot, as that was the next step to my downfall. I told him I felt the same way, and that a day had not passed when I didn't think about him, and just like that we had rekindled something so forbidden, and one thing led to another, and we had sex at his apartment that night. His wife had gone on a business trip too, given the fact that she had a very big role in her family business. So coupled with my husband's absence too, we had all the freedom to go wild and unleash all we had kept inside for the past 6 years. After my daughter got discharged, our relationship did not get discharged too. Instead, it continued, and we even took it to another level. It got to a point where we started taking turns as we would display our madness in his apartment today and the next time in my husband's home. Looking back, I can't come to terms with the fact that I committed such a sinful act, all for the sake of pleasure. When my husband came back, I returned to being a faithful and loving housewife, but then I couldn't bring myself to be with my husband anymore. He suddenly felt like a stranger to me, and each time he tried to touch me, I would make up one excuse or another just to avoid him. My husband was so cool, and he never got upset. He tried to understand me and never made an issue about it. I guess that gave me more power to explore, and I started lying about going to visit my mom or a friend, but I would end up going to Daniel's. We would have fun, and then I'd return back home like nothing happened. This went on for months until my husband finally brought up the issue. He started by asking me if I was mad at him or if he had unknowingly done something to make me become distant from him lately. When I heard his questions, I felt a sense of guilt wash over me because I was well aware of how much he loved me. He loved me too much for me to treat him the way I did. I told him we were okay, and I do not have anything against him, and he did nothing wrong. He suggested that we go out on a date and try to be ourselves again. While on our date together, my husband was in front of me, but strangely, everything he tried to do for me that night just kept making me think of Daniel, and that's how I knew I had lost it. I tried to shake it off, but Daniel kept crawling back into my mind. After our date, we both went home, and we made love. Though it is shameless of me to say, that night, I made love with my husband while picturing him as Daniel, and I must admit that was the best pleasurable experience Josh and I have ever had. I tried to act normal so I wouldn't raise any suspicion, as I didn't want to lose what I had with Daniel, and I was also not ready to lose my marriage as well. I had that strong resolve until the night Daniel asked me if I would marry him if he divorced his wife. I was surprised by the question, but strangely, I wasn't upset, and then he told me he was going to divorce his wife, and if I really loved him, I'd divorce my husband and choose him. I went home that day, and Daniel's words were all I could think of, and just then, a thought crossed me. If I were to divorce Josh and marry Daniel, it felt like picking up a story that had ended years ago. I wouldn't have to live in fear that the truth about my daughter's paternity would come to light, as I would be marrying the real father of my child. And I would be putting things back to the way it was supposed to be, and just like that, I had decided to file for a divorce, and also open up to Daniel that my child wasn't Josh's, but his, and it would be a joy for us to finally be reunited. I had never once stopped to think about how that decision would hurt Josh, the one person who made my life whole again, the one person behind the strength and the reason I could survive those 6 long years in happiness. I had never stopped to think about the consequences of my actions. Instead, I immediately filed for a divorce the next day. My friends came over that afternoon, and one of them asked me about Daniel. You know how girls talk. They all giggled and laughed about how much I had been glowing lately, ever since Daniel and I started getting closer again. They even went as far as asking me about our intimate moments together and how it felt. I told them that Daniel's touch was always the best, as it brought out the wildest side of me, and we all laughed about it. One of them said she felt so sorry for Josh, that he is no doubt a sweet person, but it's just so sad he is not Daniel, and he was only there to clean up my mess at that time. I just sat there and let my friends tear my husband apart the way they liked, while they praised Daniel. I told them about my plans to divorce Josh, and I was going to tell him about it once he returned the next day. They all supported me, claiming Daniel was the right person for me, and I'm actually doing the right thing by letting Josh go. I felt no guilt at the time, which makes me feel terrible now. Why was I so convinced I was doing the right thing? How could I hurt someone who had never once hurt me, nor done anything wrong to deserve something like this? It's too late to think about all of it now because it's all hopeless. Would things have turned out differently if I had just ended my affair with Daniel? Would Josh be by my side right now? My husband Josh came home that day, and I couldn't wait to bring up the news about my decision to divorce him. But I never got the chance. This is because Josh broke the news that he had finally succeeded in his plans to move our family abroad due to his work, so we could finally be together, and he wouldn't have to be away from us anymore, as he would be closer to both his work and his family. I forced myself to smile at that moment, though I felt so torn between two people. One was Daniel, and the other was my husband. I was so confused about what to do that I hid the divorce papers and went downstairs to prepare lunch for us. I was cooking in the kitchen when Josh hugged me from behind. He tried to touch me, but I kept refusing, stating that I was too tired and busy. But he didn't stop hugging me, and I got irritated and pushed him. He stood still for a moment before finally asking me in a cold voice if that was truly the case. I should have suspected something was wrong. I should have known something was up, but instead I got upset. He asked me again if I was really tired and busy, and I lashed out at him saying, "I'd rather touch myself than let him pleasure me, if that's what he wanted to hear." To my shock, Josh grabbed the pot of the food I was preparing and threw it to the floor in a fit of rage. My eyes widened as fear gripped me. It was actually my first time seeing Josh react that way. He had always tried to remain calm and clear-headed, even when he was angry, but seeing him lose control like that left me cold and trembling. Then he began thundering. He told me he had returned home yesterday because he was overwhelmed with joy and couldn't wait to tell me about the fact that he had succeeded in getting our visas, and we could now live with him abroad where he worked, and he wouldn't need to be traveling to and fro or be away from us anymore, only for him to hear my despicable conversation with my friends. Each word he dropped followed with loud shattering from things he was smashing. Josh had completely lost it. I stood paralyzed as I didn't know how to react. He asked if Daniel was really so important to me that I'd even consider divorcing him. Immediately I heard him bring up the divorce. I knew everything was over. There was nothing more I could say or do, and all I could utter was, "I'm sorry." Josh clearly told me he wasn't an idiot and that he loved me too much. He was willing to be stupid for me, but hearing me say all that made him realize there was really no place for him in my heart, and he was just wasting his time. He told me to pack my things and leave his house, saying he didn't want to see my face and that he didn't know what he might do to me. Then just like that, he stormed out of the house. When I finally gathered my thoughts, instead of searching for my husband to plead for mercy, I rushed to Daniel's apartment, only to find out that he had left the country that night with his wife. He had completed the campaign he came for at the hospital and returned to his family. I passed out the moment I heard the news and woke up a day after. When I rushed home, my husband had already left for an emergency at the company, and he had sent my things to my mom's place. I fell to the ground wailing as I do not know where to begin from. I tried to talk to my friends, but none of them were willing to listen because they were all afraid to get involved. I feel exposed and overwhelmed by the reality of my actions. I honestly don't know what to do anymore. My husband will be back soon, and I'm terrified of how to make things right. I don't know how to appease him. I don't know how to ask for his forgiveness or if he'll ever take me back. I can't bear the thought of losing him. I feel like I'm losing my mind, and that's why I'm reaching out for help, to share my shame. I know I've made terrible mistakes and I don't deserve another chance, but everyone makes mistakes, right? I just need advice on what to do next. Please help me. Update. Is this really how life is? How is it that nothing we want ever goes as planned and it keeps surprising us in the worst way possible? It's true what they say. Nothing can ever be kept a secret forever, and one day it will come to light, one way or another. I messed up, and that was so foolish of me. I have no excuse to offer. I'm at my lowest right now, and I don't know what else to do. The thing is, on the day Josh arrived home from his trip, I had already called my mom over, knowing he would be back that day. I wanted her there to help me plead with him because I was too afraid to talk to him alone, especially after the tantrum he threw the last time we spoke before he left. When Josh arrived, I immediately dropped to my knees. But before I could say anything, he handed me the divorce papers I had prepared with my own hands. He had signed them. He told me he used his trip to think about everything, and the only decision he could come up with was to give in to what I wanted. Hearing his words felt like a knife had just been plunged into me, and as my eyes filled with tears, everything around me seemed to fade into darkness. I started begging him to please forgive me and give us another chance, but he laughed at my words and asked if there was ever a moment when there truly was an us. He continued, saying he was fully aware that I never truly had feelings for him, but believed that over time I would come to love him just as deeply if we stayed together as a couple. He admitted he had been happy during the past years, which made it all the more painful to accept the reality that those years were nothing more than a facade, an illusion that never truly existed. My mom also pleaded, but he wouldn't listen. Just when he was about to walk out on me, I immediately yelled, asking him what he was going to do about our child, that he should at least think about how our daughter would feel. I was so desperate. I didn't want to give up so easily. I was determined to try everything, even if it meant using my own daughter to save myself. But in the end, it was all in vain. Josh's face darkened the moment he heard my words. He was so furious. He walked up to me and with one hand pulled me up by my arm, gripping it so tightly that I feared it might snap. Then his words hit me. He asked how much lower I was willing to stoop, calling me nothing but a heartless person. He said I disgusted him and that he couldn't understand why he had ever been so in love with someone like me. He told me he had been willing to remain ignorant until the end for the sake of the child, but seeing me stoop so low as to use my own daughter for personal gain proved that I didn't deserve his effort. That was when he revealed that he had known all along the child was never his. My mom sank to the sofa and was short of words. Hearing Josh's words, I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I just knew it was over for me. He went on to tell me that he found out the day I gave birth when he had hurried back from his trip only to hear my mother and I talking about it. He was hurt, but then he decided he wasn't going to use that against me as it wasn't my fault and I was also hurting. He was happy just being by my side and he was going to be patient and wait until the day I could honestly tell him the truth, but he felt he was wrong and he regrets his decision at that time. He said I was hopeless and I was never going to change, and that he never wants to see my face or have anything to do with me in this lifetime or another, and just like that, he left me, and that was the last time I saw him. I cried endlessly that day and in the days that followed, constantly asking myself why I had done all of it. I destroyed my own marriage for something that never existed. How on earth am I going to live with myself knowing fully well it's all my fault and I have no one else to blame for it? My daughter cries almost every day asking for Josh, and I break down crying each time as I don't have the answers to give her. How do I start explaining to her that her father and I are no longer together? How do I start telling her Josh isn't even her real father? How do I tell her that the very man I was cheating with happens to be her real dad? How on earth is she going to accept all that? I pray every day and wish every morning that when I open my eyes, Josh would forgive me and come back to me. Call me foolish or selfish. I'm willing to accept everything. I just need my husband back. Why did I only have to realize everything now? I wake up so afraid as I fight to accept the harsh reality that Josh is no longer my husband and is never coming back. How do I live now? I know I have to continue living for the sake of my daughter, but how am I supposed to do that when even seeing my daughter reminds me of my shameless decisions? Is there ever forgiveness for me in this life? Will I ever get better? Now I spend my remaining days in a world of questions and wishes. I deeply regret everything.